everybody, and welcome, and we're back. The View from the Top is back, and we've got a great episode for you today. We're going to have a lot of fun, and it's great just to see everybody, or ready to be seeing you. What we're doing today is we're going to get political. We are going to talk politics, and my gosh, it's going to be fun. It's going to be heated. We're going to get into some not just politics, but how politics is going to impact global mobility. And yes, we're going to be talking about the US election. And yes, we're going to be talking about Brexit. And yes, we're going to be talking about other geopolitical trends that are facing us. And we've got some great guests, and we've got a whole new look for The View from the Top. But the special guest today is going to be you, because we're going open mic. So you will have the opportunity to jump on, to join the conversation. You can join the conversation in the normal way. You can join the conversation by writing in the comments box, and oh my gosh, it's great to be back. But join the conversation. Let us know you're there. Give us some of your comments. But also, we're going to go open mic. So later on in the show, you're going to be able to come on stage and share your views. So let me see. We're already getting people coming in. So we're getting people from London, hi Gushran, from Connecticut, from Nashville. People are coming in from all over. Just looking at these people coming in. So this is fabulous. We're getting so many people coming into the show today, and it's a great show because, as I said, we're going to get political. We're going to be talking about some really meaningful, deep stuff that I think is going to affect all of our jobs, our careers, our lives certainly over the next 4 years, and if maybe over many more years to come. But as ever, what I do want to do before I get into today is I just want to tell you a little bit about what's going on with Beneva, about some of the things that we've got coming up. The first thing I should say is that we formed a strategy council. We've taken some senior leaders in the mobility industry from around the world who have joined us now. And it's great to have these people on board. And the very first one we've got is Michelle Durkin, who many of you know. Michelle is out there and is our polling researcher. Let's see if I can find Michelle. Hey, Michelle, how are you doing?
Hey, Brian. Good. How are you doing?
Yeah, good to see you, and welcome to our strategy council.
Thank you. It's exciting to be part of it. Yeah,
it's great to have you on board. It's great to have you on board. But we've got more, actually. We've also brought in a very senior reward director who many of you will know. And that's a guy called Mike Piker. And Mike Piker's joined our strategy council too. And Mike is going to be on The View from the Top next week. And we're going to do a session on the view of the reward director. And I think this is really important because, in my experience, the vast majority of global mobility professionals report into reward. But what does the reward function actually think of global mobility? What do they think of us? And we're going to be talking with Mike next week, and we're going to be getting his perspective, and hopefully we'll get other people coming on the conversation too, about what the reward director expects from global mobility and what global mobility can do to be of more use to the reward function. We've also got another person who's joined our strategy council. I'm absolutely delighted to say that Wes Okamura has joined us. So Wes, many of you out there in LinkedIn world will know, Wes is he's recently retired, the West Coast lead for EY, for their people advisory services practice. And he's joined us at Benevo. So that's really exciting. And then the other thing I'd say is that we've also got, and this is again next week on Thursday, is we're doing Benevo Bytes is back too. And we're going to be talking about how you can use Benevo Bytes alongside your favorite relocation management company. So that can be, whichever RMC you use, and how Benevo will fit in with that. So we've got lots of exciting stuff to talk about, but let's get into the politics. As I said, we are open mic. So if you want to join us, if you want to come on open mic into the show, then this is the link you need. We're going to post that link in the comments box. So hopefully you'll see that there. You'll see that in the comments box. But also, I just take a photo of it with your phone. That might be the best thing to do, because it's StreamYard.com, and then you've got this gobbledygook of 33 FAYBGKEE. So anyway, that's something that, just take a photo of it with your phone, or it's in the comments box, and then you can join us open mic. Anyway, let me bring our guests on. We've got some fabulous guests. I'm delighted to say that our guests today are Pat Jurgens and Julia Onslow-Cole. Let me just bring those on. I'll bring Julia on. Hey, Julia, how are you doing?
Hi. Very well, thank you. Yeah, very good.
You've had a good break?
Very nice, thank you. Yes, and I'm very pleased to see there's someone else listening in from Winchester. That's where I am in the UK.
Okay.
Oh, actually, 2 people. Yeah.
You're in Winchester today?
Mm.
Okay. And we've also welcomed to the show Pat. How are you doing, Pat?
I'm doing fine. I'm pleased to join you today.
Well, it's great to have you here, Pat. And just to let people know, during our break, we've decided to go a little bit new look with some of the changes we're going to be making. And one of the changes that we're going to make is that a lot of people have said to us how much they love the immigration updates, but people have also said to us is they'd actually like some tax updates too. So what we're going to be doing now going forward is we're going to be having tax updates and immigration updates. And well, we're going to see how it goes, but our aim is to rotate it. So next week, we're going to have tax updates from Pat, and then the week after Julia, and then back to Pat, and we'll rotate. And where it's important and there's something really topical to come up we want to discuss, we'll get all of them on board. So we're going to have some great stuff, a lot more technical comments that we had as well. So it's going to be really interesting. And one of the things about the way we're doing this thing now, about the way that that we're working, is that we're putting in this whole ask us anything concept. So if you've got questions you want to ask us, then just put them into the comments box, and we will feed in those comments. Okay, so I'm just seeing how many people we've got. We've got so many people coming on board. It's lovely to see you. So we've got, oh my gosh, we've got Elizabeth Soley from Connecticut. We've got Joshua Rose from, actually doesn't say where you're from, Joshua. We've got people from all over. Andrea Stakowicz, how was my holiday? I had a great holiday, and I thoroughly recommend Sicily to anybody who fancies going. That's where I was on my vacation. But anyway, let's move on. Time is moving on. So let's just start off talking about global mobility and the politics of global mobility. And Pat, Julia, I mean, you've both worked in mobility profession for a long time. What's your experience about how the politics is beginning to impact global mobility?
Well, I think politics have always impacted global mobility in the sense that government policy is driven by politics. And we're seeing that much more acutely now coming out of the pandemic, because, we're seeing across the world government making, restrictive immigration policies to protect resident labour. And they're trying to sort of balance that up against the need to, really boost the economy, in which case they do need to bring in overseas workers. So it's a bit of a dilemma, but there's certainly a huge political element to it.
Yeah, I would echo that too. In that tax policy is always driven by politics. Tax policy is written by politicians. So we will certainly see that evolve as we go forward with this dichotomy.
Yeah, and I think, to my mind, one of the big things is that, is that we all grew up at a time when globalization was seen as a good thing. I think by and large, is companies globalized, free trade was good. That's how countries got richer. We all traded with each other. Free trade was good. Low trade barriers were good. And then at some point, probably about 15 years ago or so, maybe 20 years ago, we started seeing the rise of nationalism, of saying, well, actually, globalism isn't good. We started seeing anti-globalist movements. And the argument there was that globalization might be good for the economy, but actually it's not good for me, because my job has been outsourced to where the Philippines or India or wherever, or Mexico, wherever it's been outsourced to. And so there's this feeling that there were the, if you like, the split between the well-to-dos and the left behinds. And we've seen that, you know, whether we've seen that in the US or we've seen that in France or in Germany or in the UK, we've seen this whole sort of trend of globalism is bad. And, you know, and what cut us open, I think a lot of us are globalists in nature because that's the industry we work in. But actually what we're seeing is almost within our economies is something saying that actually nationalism is more important than globalism. And what gets really interesting there, I think, is this concept of, well, actually, where do our loyalties lie? You know, is our primary loyalty to our corporation, which employs us, or to our nation to which we were born? And there's very different value systems. You know, if you think about it, the value system of a company is meritocratic, typically. Value system of a company is the company has got to make as much money as possible in the long term, so not necessarily short term. And it's all about being global. Whereas the value system of a country is all about, we've got to put our citizens first. We've got to defend our citizens. And of course, our citizens are not the same people as who our co-employees are, who might be global. So we've got two different value systems going on. And I think that is the issue that we're facing. And in many ways, it gets us onto the, you know, onto the US election in a way, which clearly is going to be the biggest event of the next, you know, couple of months, certainly in US politics and maybe in global politics is the biggest event of the next few months. And it gets us into this whole debate of how nationalistic or how globalistic we want our countries to be. And we're going to get into that, but actually I know, Michelle, we did a little bit of research about this, didn't we? I don't know if you can just talk us through some of the research that we did.
Sure. Well, we touched upon a couple of areas. I think we were talking about, in terms of the presidential candidate, who is better for mobility, and really that was really the angle and the point of the question, that which presidential candidate is better for mobility, our current President Trump or Biden. Okay. So that was the question.
Before we get to the answer, before we get to the audience, the answer, I mean, let's ask the audience. I mean, I appreciate there's sometimes a minute or so delay on this, but to the audience, you know, who do you think will be the better US president for the global mobility profession? And that's a very specific question. we're not asking the question, who is the best president for the nation or for the world or for law and order or for the economy or something. It's very, very specific. Which is the best US presidential candidate, or who is the better US presidential candidate for our profession, for global mobility? And we're starting getting some answers coming in. I can see Joe Biden, hands down, Joe Biden, surely, Joe Biden. Just something a bit here. Biden.
I'm not sure there's a debate here to be had, based on what we're seeing.
Wall, guys, Bob Church said. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, this is. Why don't you just say what the result?
Well, I have to tell you. Did you see? There's one vote for Rob Lesser. So.
Oh dear.
So listen, overwhelming. Our poll results also said Biden would be better for our industry at 84%. There were 16% of respondents that did say Trump. So I'm not sure we have it. Oh, all right. I see one come up. Somebody else is saying Joe Exotic. For those of you who watch Tiger King, you'll know who Joe Exotic is.
We're getting a few comments now as well. It's evening out. We're getting a few more Trump fans out there. I mean, let's just make a couple of points about this polling result. I mean, the first thing I would say is, there is no way Joe Biden is going to win 84% to 16%. So
I would agree.
We've got to recognize the fact that this poll that we did is not reflective of the reality of the way the vote is going to go. So that raises a couple of questions about why is our audience so different to what any other poll would expect. And we're seeing that in the comments that are coming up on LinkedIn as well. It's so predominantly Biden over Trump. So there's got to be various reasons why. Now, one reason clearly is we are doing something global here, and only US citizens get to vote. So, a lot of the people voting the poll don't have a vote. That may be part of it. It may also be something to do with the fact that global mobility professionals are themselves a subset. But Pat and Julia, why do you think we're getting this response, so much so for Biden compared to Trump, compared to what any other poll would normally say?
Well, I think from an immigration perspective, and we're going to, I think, do a quick recap of what's happened. Just, since we've been doing View from the Top, there's just been a series of different immigration restrictions that have really, restricted global mobility. And so I think, from that perspective, you can see that, it is very restrictive.
Those restrictions even before the pandemic occurred. So we understand that Biden will likely try to open that up. He's likely not to be charging tariffs. He's likely to be rejoining, allies and multilateral agreements. So all in all, it would be better for global mobility in general.
Okay, let's just look at some of the comments that have come on. By the way, out there in the audience, if you want to join the debate and come on live, we did post it before. Hopefully we'll post it again, this link. Do come and join the conversation. We'd be very interested in your views. So here are some views. This is from Fiona. As someone who is not American and based outside the US, my belief is that America was built by immigrants. It is the world's largest melting pot of nationalities. Each immigrant has built the American nation to what it is today. The story should and must continue, but all countries need to wake up to the fact that if you want to seriously attract and retain talent long term, you must have the right programs that should not be complicated. So, interesting, another question from Mark Birchall. The better question is, why Biden? So interesting conversation. But maybe let's just take back, and I can see we've got somebody backstage who's going to be joining us. I'll bring them on in a moment, but before I do, maybe we should just do a little bit of a recap. I think that would be helpful, because what we're saying, and oh, by the way, if anybody wants to come on open mic, that is that's the thing to talk about. But before we can talk about whether Trump or Biden is the better president going forward, I think it makes sense to look at what actually Trump has achieved over his last 4 years and look at the question about, well, how has that impacted mobility? So maybe let's just start off with a bit of a recap. And maybe, Julia, you could just talk to us about the last 4 years and what Trump has achieved in terms of immigration and how that impacts global mobility.
Yeah, so I'm just caveating it because I think rather than just do the last 4 years, I think we only just need to do from April, because I think these are things that we've talked about and are they're very relevant, and also because they have a lot of clues about what might happen afterwards. And the second thing I just wanted to say is, I'm not a US attorney, and I just want to say a huge thank you to Bo Cooper and the team in Washington. I actually managed to trap Bo. He was sitting in his car going on a very long journey of several hours across the US, and I managed to get onto his mobile, and he couldn't get me off for several hours, so he's very good talking to me. But I think if we recap what's happened since the pandemic, we had the tweet on April the 20th saying that, Trump would temporarily halt immigration during the pandemic, and he said he would issue an executive order. Then we had the proclamation itself a couple of days later, and you'll recall that that didn't have as much effect as we thought, because it was mainly for green card applicants who are coming to the US, and a lot of them were actually already in the US, and also the consulates were closed anyway. Then we had the second proclamation in June, which was the non-immigrant entry ban, and that's effective until the end of this year. And again, the focus was on people who are outside of the UK. And that was really focusing on H1Bs and Ls. And the thing is that when we were talking about that, there was a lot of speculation about what else would happen. And I don't know if you recall, but there was a lot of speculation about huge hikes in fees of H1Bs, some more changes to students with STEM degrees, more changes on H4s who are the spouses of H1Bs. And although we understand there might be something coming out about people on client sites, although there's been nothing on these other areas that we were speculating on, this would be quite a fruitful area to look at if he continued and he was looking at immigration policy changes. So we've had some clarity on the national interest exception, but in practice that doesn't really have much effect because it's so difficult to get consular employments. But I think that what's really important as well to say is in the last couple of weeks, we've got two really major things, and I'm not sure that everybody has quite realised the significance of them. The first is that this point about federal contracts, so that there's an executive order asking every government agency to review its federal contracts and ask, are there any foreign workers there or subcontracted? And if so, what is the assessment of their harm to local workers? And they must supply their findings to the government. So we readers don't know. That's put a spotlight on agency heads, but we don't know what they're going to come back with. But the second really important thing for employers is that there's a memo, an agreement between the Department of Homeland Security and the Department for Labour, so that the Department of Labour can use information from the Department of Homeland Security in its investigation on H1Bs. And that's really quite significant because it means that the Department of Labour can be really broad in what they're investigating. It's not just complaint driven, and they can take on other sorts of information. So putting those two together, you are in a situation now where there's a lot more compliance. And even though, Congress, is very unlikely to pass the law because of it being too partisan, the executive branch has really managed to tighten up access, and then that can continue. So I think that, it's rather interesting to kind of look at that history and then see where we are. I mean, I think going on to say, what would Trump do? I mean, we know that Stephen Miller, who's the president's advisor, thinks immigration be tightened further. But, Fiona made a really brilliant point, and I'm so pleased you highlighted her quote about the importance of governments realizing that their immigration programs have such an effect on the economy. And you see this, it's not just in the US, but in the US, for example, you've seen the effect of what's happened on overseas students by saying, not offering in-person classes and consulates being closed. And I think that there is a small argument that you could perhaps envisage that, if Trump took another term, then maybe it could be possible that he might feel calmer about things, and it might be that there would be, less emphasis on sort of restrictions and a more tempered and nuanced approach because of the concern about the economy, because as Fiona said, it all weighs in. But obviously one thing is, having really good stability and really knowing and predictability, that's always what companies need. So I think that's another thing that is a concern. And I think, just turning to Joe Biden, I think it's really obvious he'd do something about DACA, about asylum and the border very quickly. But I think, you know, the other thing is, you know, he does support unions, and I think it might be difficult for him to just very quickly row back on some of the business, because there is high unemployment, and then, you know, you must obviously really protect resident labour. So it's a very, very difficult situation.
Okay. We'll come on, I think, in a bit to, you know, what a President Biden administration might look like. But, you know, I mean, what I want to start off with is just focusing on what has happened during a President Trump administration. And so we talked about immigration. I mean, somebody made a point to me earlier, which I thought was fascinating. They said that most immigration professionals tend to be against Trump, but most tax professionals tend to be pro-Trump. I don't know how that plays out with our audience, and Pat, I'm going to come on to you. But why would tax professionals tend to like Trump, and what has Trump done from a tax perspective? Maybe just talk about that.
Sure. Well, his signature tax legislation was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That was about 3 years ago now. And if you recall, that provided for tax cuts, tax rate cuts, a rather large adjustment as to how individuals are being taxed for deductions and the like. And similarly with the corporate side, there was a large tax cut. And so that is probably why most tax professionals would be supporting Trump. But not all of us.
Well, some of the stuff he's done has been bad for mobility, hasn't it?
Yeah.
In the way of allowances.
Right. And especially in global mobility, there was a lot of hue and cry about the non-deductibility of moving expenses. So, you know, there was some trade-offs that were made in that tax legislation. So we'll see what happens going forward. I would guess that if we were to try to look ahead to what Trump might do if he's reelected, he would essentially continue with those same policies, trying to cut more taxes. He certainly talked about that in the past few months, that he would be interested in providing a middle-class tax cut, providing a further tax cut in capital gains income, and, you know, payroll tax changes as well, which are quite interesting to hear what his proposals are for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I suppose, do we think and people in the audience, you know, we're getting loads and loads of comments on LinkedIn, but if you want to jump on, again, if we can just post that link, then, you know, do come on and join us online. But do we think that a second-term Trump would be more of the same or more moderate, or would it be the fact that a second-term Trump isn't worried about winning a third term and therefore might be even more radical? I mean, what do we think a second-term Trump might look like? You know, Pat and Michelle, I'm conscious of the fact that I'm not an American.
He will try again to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which does have some tax provisions in it. And, you know, like I said, he will likely be trying to advocate for additional tax cuts. So that would be my expectation from him, more of the same.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, he's, you know, he's doesn't have to worry about getting reelected, so he's even less accountable than he is now. So he could be more radical in his proposals.
That's what I was wondering. Michelle, from your perspective, do you think a second-term Trump would be more radical or more moderate, or the same?
I would say about the same, or maybe a bit more. I think it would sort of boost his confidence maybe from where he is at this point in time. I think there were some comments made early on when it was confirmed that Biden was his, you know, the official Democratic candidate, and I think he had some doubt. So I think if he wins, I think he, you know, it's another feather in his cap.
And if I look at some of the comments that are coming in, so Rob Lesser there, he has no boundaries and will do whatever he thinks is in his interests. More of the same and more radical. Laura Levinson agreeing with Rob Lesser. Molly making the interesting point there. The impact of COVID on mobility remains paramount. I think we'll come on to that. Lisa Schmidt-Chapman, more of the same, plus a touch of radical. And here's one, Melanie Klatschka, more corporate tax cuts, I imagine. Pat, do you think we're going to see more corporate tax cuts if we get a second-term Trump?
He hasn't really talked about that, so I'm not sure. I've given up trying to predict what Trump will do. He's somewhat unpredictable, but he has talked about some individual tax cuts. But I don't know if anybody else that's joined us today has any thoughts on that.
And I would say, I think also how COVID is contributing to our economic situation here. You know, I think it'll be interesting to see what kind of reliefs happen or continue for individuals or small businesses. You know, I think that's going to have a big impact on us as a nation and community and our economy and things of that nature.
Okay. Have we got anybody out there, Trump supporter, who'd be willing to sort of come on, jump on the show, jump on the open mic and join us? Because I'm very keen to have balance to hear the other side of the argument. So if there's people who'd like to come on the show, be helpful. Let's look at some of the other comments. A moderating force from Michael Cadden. There may be a Democratic Senate. Joshua Rose Radical, he wants a third term. Interesting. So he'll go further right to solidify his base and impact change for his base's platform. So, you know, we're getting Laura Levin, scary with no guardrails. He'd be the opposite of a lame duck. And I think that I have heard that comment that you know, a second term Trump could be more radical because, as Laura puts it, he's got no guardrails. And again, you know, we're seeing that other comments are making the same. Maybe from that slightly more positive spin, more radical to set his legacy. Although, of course, it depends whether radical is a good or bad thing. Scary is a good word. Let's just turn this around. I am very keen to hear from Trump supporters. So if there's anybody out there who'd like to share either anonymously or come on the show live, would love to hear from you. But let me just ask a different question. Let me ask this question to Julia and to Pat. Let's assume that Joe Biden does win. Okay, so he's there come January. He's got the reins. What do you think are going to be the first things that he's going to repeal? And what are the things that Trump has introduced are the things you think might actually stay? Maybe Biden would have introduced them, but he won't actually get around to repealing them. So if you were advising Joe Biden or you're putting yourself in Joe Biden's shoes, what do you think would be his first 30 days, first 100 days in terms of immigration and tax and anything that impacts us in global mobility? Pat, do you want to jump on that one first?
I think he'll be looking to revoke many of the executive orders that Trump has put in to the extent that he can. He's already said that he wants to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. So, yes, I think he'll be trying to reestablish some of those bilateral, multilateral arrangements with other countries. So I think that would be good for the global mobility industry. As for taxes, I don't know how quickly they can get it done, but certainly I would think that they would be looking to reverse some of the tax cuts that were brought in 3 years ago with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So he will be focusing on increasing taxes, but only for folks that are wealthy and for companies, for corporate entities. So that is his, at least his announced platform, is to reverse some of those tax cuts. And I think it's in part to collect some revenue, maybe address some income inequality, and also to fund some of the programs that he wants to implement in his administration, such as Green New Deal, workers and unions and jobs in the U.S., that type of thing.
Okay, and before we go on to the immigration aspects, I mean, I'm just looking at the comments on LinkedIn, and here's one. Now, Melanie, you've got to come on the show. As someone who has worked with the man, he is out for himself. He will do whatever will benefit him, his family, and his business. Now, you make a comment like that on LinkedIn, Melanie. You've got to come on the show. And here we've got Tracy saying, Melanie Kleshka, oh my God, you need to take the mic and speak. Come on, Melanie. But actually, Melanie's response, $5 million NDA. Well, look, you're only with friends, Melanie. It's a private conversation. Nobody's listening. Come on, we'd love to have you on the show. We'd all say, obviously, as quietly as you can. So, who knows? It'll be great to get you on the show, Melanie, if you can join us. Anyway, let's just go back. Julia, why don't you just tell us from your perspective about what you think will happen?
I mean, I think that there will be a concentration on looking very quickly at borders, asylum and DACA. I think they will be the real priorities. And I think with the business immigration, there's a lot, because it's done by executive order, and a lot of them are a lot of these things like investigations and asking questions of government agency heads. They're things that can easily be, just tailed off. And, there's a lot that could be done very quickly that's, out there at the moment. So, I mean, I think it's difficult to say. I mean, I have to say there's some really fantastic comments coming in from people, aren't there? And Elizabeth Prensa-Soli, she's put some really good comments up.
I'll try and pull those up. I see one actually. I might have to scroll up to get them. But here's actually one from Bridget Ritchie. She said, while I am not at all a Trump supporter, I worry if Biden wins, the corporate taxes he'll impose may hurt an already hurting attempt at economic vibrancy as large companies try to recover. I mean, Pat, do you think we're going to see that? Do you think we're going to see with a Biden presidency tax rates going up? Especially, I suppose, they've got to pay for, like every country, got to pay for the pandemic and the costs of furloughing and welfare support, etc. Do you think we're going to see taxes go up under a Biden presidency, or even under a new second-term Trump presidency?
Well, I think certainly with Biden, you'd expect it. It'd just be a question of timing. So I think he'll be reluctant to put in those tax increases while we're still within the current environment with the economic downturn and the pandemic. So, I would think it would happen, if it does happen, in 2021, probably in the latter half of the year. Hopefully by then we're recovered, but you never know.
Okay. Well, I think maybe we'll move on from the US election for a moment, because there are other things going on in terms of geopolitical trends around the world, and I don't want to focus solely on America, although clearly it's so important. And Julia, I know you've been looking at some interesting stuff in terms of what's going on in Asia with some geopolitical trends. I think you're talking China and Singapore and other countries. Do you want to talk a bit about what you're seeing going on at the moment?
Yes. And I think this sort of mirrors quite a lot of the comments, going back to Fiona's original comment. And what we are seeing are countries all around the world, governments all around the world, sort of trying to balance up what they can do with immigration policy to either, attract more inward investment, bring people back to their country in the face of a travel ban, or, protect resident labor. So what we're seeing in China, for example, and if you look at the China economy, it's actually doing really quite well. It's gone from minus 8.6% almost to positive. they're actually making it a lot easier for people to return. So, that's something that we've been discussing over the last few weeks, but it's much easier, the process for people to come, and also online applications, which have been very helpful. If you look at Singapore, everyone was quite shocked on Friday, where there was a sudden change in the immigration law in Singapore. And it's particularly focused on the finance industry. And I believe it is quite a reflection. And I wanted to thank Mark Buchanan, actually, and Becky Shia for talking to me in China and Singapore about this. But I think it is focused on the fact there's lots of companies who are perhaps thinking of leaving Hong Kong and maybe moving to Singapore, because the new changes announced on Friday were particularly targeting the finance industry. And there's a substantial increase that has been put on employment passes, and S passes are also now, there are changes. They've been brought under the fair consideration framework. And there's also sort of some provision that looks at, if you've reached 40 and you're still on a work permission, you should really at that age sort of almost be on a much higher salary. And although that hasn't been defined before, it sort of is now. So if you're actually in your 30s and you're sort of plateauing in your career, that might be quite difficult, because you've got to meet these wage requirements. And I think it's just very interesting. We hear, and I've heard them from several people, that there are other countries in Asia Pacific that are likely to follow suit with some quite tough new immigration protectionist policies. But then, there is that conundrum, because, Singapore's always been perceived as an amazing hub in Asia Pacific. When I started my career, that's one of the first jobs I had when I was living in Hong Kong, is looking at the fantastic and open immigration system that they did have in Singapore. And I think that, this is this whole dilemma about, obviously important to protect resident labour, but on the other hand, wanting to encourage inward investments and companies relocating.
Okay. So do you think then there's going to be a threat to Singapore from China? Is China going to try and tempt people away from Singapore, or do you think Singapore's shooting itself in the foot, or what do you think is going to happen in that region?
Well, I just think.
What about Hong Kong as well? What about China and Hong Kong? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I think it's, I can only speak about immigration policy, but I'm just really saying that from, a macro level, each government has these, real dilemmas, because you want to make your system and your country attractive. But on the other hand, there is this economic downturn. And unfortunately, the other thing that's, I think, a really important thing is, if you look at macroeconomics, although some countries like Germany are sort of recovering in a V, because of the second wave of coronavirus in places like Spain and other places in the Eurozone, and Pat would know more about this than me, the Eurozone is recovering much more slowly, and that threat of the second wave is actually impeding the path that macroeconomists actually were hopeful that we would see, if we, on the idea that we come out of the pandemic, we get a vaccine, and this has obviously wobbled the figures, and causing a retrenchment on a whole dearth of policies. Do you agree with that, Pat?
Yes, I do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Pat, from a tax point of view, and what are you seeing? And are you seeing countries beginning to adapt their tax policies to cope with the pandemic, and how do you think that might play out?
Yeah, I think that quite a few tax authorities have implemented some temporary relief and assistance for people that were affected. Special deductions if you're working from home, special deductions if you're a frontline worker, that type of thing. And we're also seeing that, again, it's this question of timing. How quickly do you want to increase the taxes? There's been some indication that some countries are trying to raise revenues just to cover the costs of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And,
certainly, we're hearing that in the UK. There's rumours, nobody knows whether they're true or not. There's rumours that they may actually treat tax capital as if it was income. So they're going to raise the rate of capital gains tax from the current rate of what is normally 20% to up to 45%. So that, you know, and we don't know what's going to happen, but that's what is being floated in the press, that there might even be increases in VAT as well, because I think, you know, the government is getting worried about the cost of the various schemes like the furlough scheme and saying, well, somehow someday we've got to fund this. I was actually listening to a debate today in Parliament, and extraordinarily, it was the Labour Party who were coming out saying you mustn't increase taxes, with rumours that the Conservatives were planning to do it. So it's like a complete reversal from normality of what you'd expect. But Pat, I think you were saying that there has been a new tax. Is it a solidarity tax in Egypt? Is that right?
Egypt. So yes, like what we were discussing as to the likelihood of tax increases in the United States, Egypt has gone through a couple waves of tax reform. So on the heels of tax increases that they implemented on July 1st, they just announced a new solidarity contribution, and must have been done relatively quickly because it has a very odd effective date. It's August 14th. You now have to pay an extra 1% solidarity tax in Egypt on employment income. So that is clearly intended to cover those additional costs that Egypt is facing as a result of the pandemic.
And is that collected through payroll? Do you know? Is it?
Yes, right.
So it's just put up the cost of, for every employee, an extra percentage point.
That's right.
Okay. I wonder.
And you know, I think a lot of other countries are still waiting to see when they can actually do this, but I get the sense that Egypt needed to do something relatively quickly because of budget shortfalls.
Yeah.
Budget shortfalls. I mean, yeah. So Julia, you were going to say?
No, I was saying, you know, some really great comments here. I mean, Henry is just, you know, just reiterating the delicate balance that needs to be met in these countries, and also someone's raising the good point that there are these nomad visas, you know, like Croatia, Estonia, Bermuda, Barbados. But the interesting thing about that is that actually a lot of them are actually on hold. So the Estonian one, which was the first one, which everyone was very excited about, the idea of having a nomad visa where you could just go and enjoy Estonia and work remotely, is that they actually haven't really got on with the policy, and particularly because they were experiencing a second wave. So again, it's really what Pat and I have just been saying about the macroeconomic picture, which, you know, again, and there's a good comment saying, well, a lot of the European countries were in a poor economic position before we went into the pandemic, but obviously this has really exacerbated things. And you know, it's just that while we have this you know, more cases coming and before we have the vaccine, it is quite it's quite difficult for countries to say really introduce the nomadic visa, because, you know, a lot of people are very nervous about flying to other countries at the moment, and particularly if they go on a quarantine list, if they want to go back and forth. So yes, it's a really positive step in the right direction and maybe a new thing, but you know, I think there's difficulties.
And what do we think is going to happen in Europe? I mean, Pat or Julia, I mean, do you want to sort of comment on, you know, what you think the changes might be in Europe? I mean, I know, well, we're going to come on in a moment to the B word to talk about Brexit. But before we get to that, before we get to the UK, what about mainland Europe? I mean, obviously, you know, maybe with the exception of Germany, a lot of these countries are suffering terribly in terms of the recession. How do we think they're going to be coping from a tax or an immigration perspective?
I don't have much of a sense for it at the moment. I think we'll get better clarity in the beginning of 2021.
Yeah, I think that Europe, I spoke to my partner, Christine Sullivan, who's, you know, a very deep expert in the way that European Commission works and European immigration policy, and Gemma Hislop, who's from our UK office and works closely with the European team. And they were saying that actually they feel, both of them were feeling that, you know, Europe is very focused on the economy, and actually they are, you know, as a whole, you know, very willing to, you know, make rules to actually make sure that the economy is working well. So when we've been talking about that very fine balance, you know, like that Henry's mentioned and Fiona's mentioned, that sort of very fine balance, but really pushing down on the economy and really trying to make sure that the rules are attractive, that's where they feel that they come out.
Okay, I think I'd like to turn on to, we haven't actually talked a lot about Brexit in our shows, but which is interesting because we're now getting to the end game. I mean, you know, we're getting to the last few months before Brexit. Well, Brexit's happened, but before, you know, the transition period is over and before we get into life outside, properly outside the EU. And we actually did a bit of research on this. And Michelle, I don't know if you can just sort of talk us through the research that we did, and then maybe we can get into a bit of a discussion about Brexit.
Sure. So I think, you know, as we've been on previous shows, I think we've talked about, you know, does the coronavirus make our world more global or less global? And I think similar along the same lines, the question we asked was, do you think that Brexit will make the UK more or less global?
No, sorry, you carry on. To my mind, this is quite an interesting question, and it's not a question that cuts across typical Brexit or anti-Brexit or pro-Brexit lines, because the vast majority of people who were pushing Brexit, who were the real Brexiteers, their line was all about building global Britain. They want Britain to be more global. So in a way, Brexit was supported by two types of people: the sorts of people who wanted Britain to be less global and have less immigrants in it, and the sort of people who were pushing Brexit because they wanted Brexit to be more global, because they wanted to create what was called Singapore on Thames. So, you know, there is an argument here. It doesn't matter whether you're a Brexiteer or not a Brexiteer, but do we think that Brexit will actually make Britain more global, which is what many of the Brexiteers wanted, but a lot didn't want? Or will it make it will Brexit Britain be less global? So, I mean, it'll be fascinating to know what our audience say. I mean, you know, before we release the answers, you know, do people feel that Brexit is going to make Britain more global, that you like the Singapore on Thames type concept, global Britain striking trade deals around the world, or do they think it's going to make Britain more insular and less global? Julia, Pat, what are your views on this?
I would pick insular. I would think it'd be less global.
Mm-hmm.
But
well, I think there's, you know, a real problem if we don't strike some sort of multinational agreement between the EU and the UK, which creates a privileged position for business travellers and services provision, because this is something that there hasn't been much focus on, and there's a lot of things that have been done for EU citizens living in the UK, UK citizens living in the EU, but we are predominantly a services sector biased country, and there is no provision at the moment for what happens when UK citizens want to go to the EU to provide services or business travel. And Christine Sullivan, who I mentioned earlier, you know, has been doing a lot of, you know, analysis of this. And I think it's something that companies are not really focused on, because they're focused very much on EU citizens who are in the UK and registering under the settlement scheme, and they're very focused on British citizens who are living in the EU, but they are catered for. And it is those people that just go to Europe to carry out services which are really vital for companies, that there needs to be something done about them. So I think that, you know, it's really, really important that people, you know, really understand all the very fine nuances of what it means if you don't have some provisions to cover that.
Absolutely. And Michelle, do you just want to tell us through what the results of the poll showed?
Sure thing. We had 23% of our respondents say it would be more global, 78% saying less global.
Okay, so what the audience seems to be saying to us is that the vast majority of people, 78% to 22, were saying that Brexit will make Britain less global, which actually was not the aim of Brexit. The aim of Brexit was to break out of the EU and be more global, not shackled to the EU. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, let's see if we got any comments on that from the audience. Andreas, short-term, less global. Molly, less global. Jeremy, more global, reaching out to old friends we abandoned in the 1970s. You know, neither more than less from Michael. So I mean, yeah, I mean, so we're getting these different views, but I think it's going to be very, very interesting over the you know, over the coming months, I suppose, to see. You know, at the moment, the mood music seems to be fairly pessimistic that there will not be a deal, or if there is a deal, it'll be a fairly threadbare deal. But there's also mood music coming out saying that actually is what the government wants, because they don't want to be tied into the level playing field on things like state competition, so they can do whatever they want in terms of subsidising, and again becoming the, you know, the Singapore on Thames type concept. So I mean, it's going to be absolutely fascinating where we get to over the coming month. This is something that we are going to come back to. We did actually do one last poll, which I'll just very quickly maybe just mention it, Michelle, because this is going to deal with some of our upcoming shows too. So yes. Michelle, yeah.
So as we welcome Pat to the show, really trying to understand from our audience what they are most interested in hearing about in terms of tax implications. So, you know, feel free to throw in your comments, but 15% of respondents said they wanted to hear about business travelers. 78% of folks said they wanted to hear about tax implications related to remote workers, and just 7% wanted to hear more about traditional expat tax. So, you know, we want to hear from you. We want to make sure we're, you know, Pat's, you know, giving out information that is helpful and relevant. So definitely, you know, let us know.
That seems to be what many of our AIRINC clients are talking about, is implications of remote workers, putting in remote work policies. How do you deal with the tax implications, that type of thing. So that's top of mind for many people right now.
Okay, so we will make sure we come back and we'll do a session specifically on remote workers at some point in the coming weeks. Just to remind everybody that next week we're back. We've got the view from the reward director, and that would be, what do reward directors think of global mobility, and conversely, how can global mobility support reward? And we'll be getting a tax update from Pat next week too. And that's on the Wednesday at the same time, 4 p.m. UK, 11 a.m. Eastern. And then the following day, on the Thursday, we've got a Benevo Bite session talking about how Benevo works with RMCs. I forgot to mention at the start of the show, but I should just mention it to the corporates who are out there, is that one of the other things that we're pleased to be offering at Benevo is a free trial. So if anybody who actually wants to try the Benevo platform, do get in contact. And we offer a free trial for 2 months, so you can try before you buy and see if you like it. Anyway, we've pretty much come to the end of the show. What I really want to do is to thank Michelle for all her research, to thank Julia for all your insights, and Pat, to welcome you to the show for the first time. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we've enjoyed having you here. And thank you.
Glad to be here.
And thank you to all our audience for taking part.
Yes, thank you.
being so interactive. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you all again next week.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.